Welcome back to the Emma podcast. I'm Eric, and here with me, as always, is Anna. Today, we're getting into a topic that's been talked about for a while, but is now actually starting to show up in how studies are being designed and executed, and that's the future of clinical trials.
More specifically, how trials are becoming decentralized, more digital, and increasingly driven by data.
And it feels like this has moved past the conceptual phase. A few years ago, decentralized trials were more experimental or limited to certain use cases. Now you're seeing sponsors actively building these elements into standard trial designs, not as a replacement, but as part of a more flexible model.
Yeah, and it's not happening in isolation either. There are a few different forces pushing this forward at the same time.
Technology is obviously a big one. The ability to collect data remotely, whether through wearable devices, mobile apps, or connected platforms, has improved a lot. But at the same time, there's also pressure on trial timelines, on enrollment, and on overall efficiency.
And then there's the patient side of it, which I think is just as important. Like,
Traditional trials can be very demanding. Patients have to travel to sites, follow strict schedules, and in some cases, that limits who can realistically participate. So when you start introducing remote visits or digital tools, it changes that experience quite a bit.
exactly, it opens things up.
You're no longer limited to patients who live close to a site or who can commit to frequent in-person visits. That has a direct impact on enrollment, but also on diversity within trials, which has been an ongoing challenge across the industry.
And it also affects retention.
If participation is more manageable, patients are more likely to stay engaged throughout the study. That consistency is important, especially when you're collecting data over longer periods of time.
And that's where the digital side really starts to reshape things.
Because once you move beyond site-based data collection, you're dealing with a very different kind of data set. Instead of periodic measurements, you might have continuous data coming in from devices. You have patient-reported outcomes being submitted electronically, sometimes in real time.
So the volume increases, but also the frequency and the variability,
And that creates a different kind of challenge.
because collecting more data doesn't automatically mean better data. It introduces questions around how that data is being captured, how reliable it is, and how it's being managed across systems.
Exactly. And from a regulatory standpoint, none of those expectations go away just because the model is more flexible.
Data still needs to be accurate, attributable, and consistent. The difference is that now you're applying those expectations to a more distributed environment.
You don't have the same level of direct oversight that you would at a physical site, so control has to be built into the process in a different way.
And I think that's where some organizations are still adjusting.
Because traditional monitoring approaches were designed around site visits and direct interaction. When patients are participating remotely, you need new ways to verify data, monitor activity, and identify potential issues.
That's where the data driven aspect becomes more than just a benefit, it becomes necessary.
With more data coming in, there's an opportunity to identify trends earlier, catch inconsistencies, and respond in real time instead of waiting until the end of the study.
And that's a pretty significant shift in how trials are managed.
Historically, a lot of analysis happened after data collection was complete. Now, there's an increasing ability to make decisions during the trial based on what's happening as it unfolds.
But that also raises the bar in terms of system reliability.
If decisions are being made in real time, there has to be confidence in the data supporting those decisions. That brings everything back to how systems are designed, how data flows are managed, and how oversight is maintained.
And I think another layer to this is how trial design itself is changing.
Once you remove the requirement for everything to happen at a single site, you have more flexibility in how studies are structured. You can incorporate different types of visits, different data sources, and different ways of interacting with patients.
That flexibility can be a huge advantage, but it also means that consistency has to be maintained in a different way.
Exactly. The fundamentals of clinical trials don't change.
You still need clear endpoints, reproducible results, and well controlled processes. The difference is that those things now need to be maintained across a more distributed model.
And that's where you start to see the balance.
It's not about replacing traditional trials entirely. It's about integrating decentralized and digital elements in a way that improves efficiency without introducing unnecessary risk.
And that balance is really what defines how successful these models are going to be.
And in this episode, we'll get into that in more detail.
We'll look at what decentralized trials actually look like in practice, how digital tools are being implemented, and what organizations need to think about, from both an operational and regulatory perspective.
Because while the direction is pretty clear, the way it's executed is what's going to matter most. When you start looking at how decentralized and digital elements are actually being implemented, it's usually not a full shift all at once.
Most organizations are taking a more hybrid approach. Certain parts of the trial remain site-based, while others are handled remotely. That might mean in-person visits for more complex procedures, combined with remote monitoring, virtual check-ins, or digital data collection in between.
That kind of structure allows sponsors to introduce flexibility without completely stepping away from the control they're used to. And it also makes the transition more manageable.
Because moving fully decentralized introduces a different set of operational challenges. Things like coordinating across multiple vendors, managing technology platforms, and ensuring that patients are properly trained on how to use devices or report data.
Those details start to matter a lot more when the site is no longer the central point of control.
And I think that's where operational complexity tends to increase.
You're not just running a trial, you're managing an ecosystem.
You might have wearable devices collecting continuous data, mobile applications capturing patient-reported outcomes, telehealth platforms supporting virtual visits, and back-end systems integrating all of that information.
Each of those components needs to function reliably on its own, but also work together in a way that's consistent and traceable. And when that coordination isn't fully aligned, issues start to show up.
Data can become fragmented, timelines can slip, and it becomes harder to maintain a clear view of what's happening across the study.
So integration becomes just as important as the individual tools themselves.
And that's something that often gets underestimated early on.
There's a lot of focus on selecting the right technology, but less attention on how those technologies interact once they're in place.
Exactly. And from a regulatory standpoint, that interaction matters.
It's not enough for each system to be validated independently. There needs to be confidence that data is flowing correctly between systems, that it's not being altered unintentionally, and that there's a clear audit trail from collection through analysis. And that brings everything back to data integrity again.
Because regardless of how the data is collected, whether it's at a site or through a wearable device, the expectations are the same.
It needs to be reliable, attributable, and consistent across the entire life cycle. And I think another area where this becomes more visible is monitoring.
Traditional monitoring models were built around site visits and source data verification. With decentralized trials, that model doesn't always apply in the same way.
So you start to see a shift toward more centralized and risk-based monitoring approaches.
Using data to identify where attention is needed, rather than applying the same level of oversight everywhere.
Which can actually be more efficient, but it requires strong data visibility. You need to be able to see what's happening across the trial in real time or close to it and have confidence in the signals you're seeing. Otherwise, it becomes difficult to prioritize effectively.
And that's where data-driven decision-making becomes more embedded in the process.
Instead of waiting for periodic reviews, teams are looking at trends as they develop. Enrollment patterns, patient engagement, data consistency, all of these can be monitored continuously.
And that allows for earlier intervention when something isn't going as expected, which can have a real impact on timelines.
Because one of the biggest challenges in clinical trials has always been delays.
Whether it's slow enrollment, protocol deviations, or data issues that aren't identified until later, those things add up.
Being able to detect and address them earlier can make a significant difference. But at the same time, it requires a higher level of coordination.
Because decisions are being made more dynamically.
You need clear processes for how those decisions are evaluated, documented, and implemented. Otherwise, you risk introducing inconsistency. And that's really the balance that organizations are trying to manage. Like,
Taking advantage of flexibility and real-time data, while still maintaining the structure and control that regulators expect.
and that balance isn't always easy.
It requires alignment across teams, clear communication, and systems that are designed to support both flexibility and consistency.
And I think that's where experience starts to matter. Organizations that have gone through this transition tend to approach it differently. They focus more on integration up front, they define roles and responsibilities more clearly, and they invest in processes that support ongoing oversight. Whereas organizations that are newer to this may focus more heavily on the technology itself and then adjust as challenges come up.
And that difference in approach can impact how smoothly things run. Because in a decentralized model, small gaps can scale quickly. If something isn't clearly defined or consistently applied, it can affect multiple parts of the trial at once. So having that structure in place early becomes really important.
And that's something we'll build on in the next part of the discussion.
Looking more closely at what regulators are expecting specifically in decentralized and digital trial models, and how organizations can align their approach to meet those expectations while still taking advantage of these newer capabilities.
Because the direction is clear, but execution is where most of the complexity sits.
When you look at how regulators are responding to decentralized and digital trial models, the message is actually pretty consistent.
There's support for innovation, but the expectations around control, data integrity, and patient safety remain exactly the same.
If anything, those expectations become more visible because of how data is being collected and managed.
And one of the biggest areas regulators are focused on is data reliability. When data is coming from multiple sources, wearables, mobile apps, remote reporting, it introduces more variability. Devices may perform differently, patients may use them inconsistently, and data may be transmitted across different platforms before it's ultimately analyzed.
All of that creates more points where something can go wrong.
So the expectation is that sponsors understand those risks and have controls in place to manage them.
That includes validating the devices being used, ensuring that data is captured consistently, and being able to demonstrate that what's collected reflects what actually happened. And that's not always straightforward, because unlike a controlled site environment, you're relying on patients in real-world settings. That introduces variability that can't be completely eliminated.
So the focus shifts from eliminating variability to managing it, understanding where it might occur, monitoring for it, and having processes in place to address it when it does.
Another area that's getting more attention is patient safety oversight. Even in decentralized models, the responsibility for patient safety doesn't change.
If anything, it requires more coordination because you're no longer relying solely on in person interactions to identify issues. And
You may need to detect safety signals through data trends, remote check-ins, or alerts generated by digital systems.
that requires clear processes.
Who is reviewing the data? How often? What triggers follow-up? How are issues escalated?
Those questions need defined answers, and they need to be consistently applied.
Because in a distributed model, gaps in oversight can be harder to detect, and that's where monitoring strategies become critical.
As we mentioned earlier, there's a shift toward more centralized and risk based monitoring, but that doesn't mean less oversight.
It means a different type of oversight, more focused, more data-driven, and more dependent on having clear visibility into what's happening across the trial.
And that visibility needs to be supported by systems that can handle the volume and complexity of data being generated. Because without that, it becomes difficult to distinguish between normal variation and something that actually requires attention.
Another expectation that continues to come up is documentation.
Even though the model is more flexible, the requirement to document processes, decisions, and data flows doesn't change.
Sponsors need to be able to clearly describe how the trial is designed, how data is collected, how it's verified, and how it's used.
And that documentation needs to reflect how the trial actually operates.
Not just how it was initially planned.
Because decentralized elements can evolve during a study where adjustments may be made, technologies may be updated, and processes may shift.
Those changes need to be captured and controlled.
Otherwise, it becomes difficult to maintain consistency.
And consistency is still one of the core things regulators are evaluating.
Are processes being followed as defined? Are deviations understood and addressed? Is there alignment between what's documented and what's happening in practice? Those questions don't go away just because the trial model changes.
And I think that's an important point.
Decentralization doesn't reduce regulatory expectations, it redistributes where those expectations apply.
Instead of being concentrated at a site, they extend across systems, vendors, and patient interactions.
Which means sponsors need to have a broader view of control.
They need to understand not just individual components, but how everything fits together.
How data moves, how decisions are made, and how oversight is maintained across the entire process. And
And that's where organizations that take a more structured approach tend to perform better.
they define roles clearly, they align systems up front, and they build processes that support both flexibility and consistency. And that structure allows them to take advantage of decentralized models without introducing unnecessary risk,
Because ultimately, that's the goal.
not just to make trials more efficient or more accessible, but to do it in a way that maintains confidence in the data and the outcomes.
And that's where we'll bring everything together in the final part of the discussion.
Looking at what this means long term and how organizations can build trial models that are not only more flexible and patient friendly, but also scalable and compliant as expectations continue to evolve.
When you start thinking about what this means long term, it's clear that decentralized and digital elements aren't just a temporary shift. They're becoming part of how clinical trials are going to be designed moving forward.
But that doesn't mean everything becomes fully remote or fully digital.
What's emerging is a more balanced model, one where sponsors are selecting the right combination of site based and decentralized components, depending on the study, the patient population, and the type of data being collected.
And that level of flexibility is valuable, but it also means there isn't a one size fits all approach anymore.
Each trial requires a more deliberate design.
What should remain centralized? What can be decentralized? What level of oversight is needed for each component?
Those decisions become part of the strategy, not just the execution.
And I think that's where organizations start to differentiate themselves,
Not just in how they use technology, but in how they design systems around it.
because the technology itself is becoming more accessible.
What's harder to replicate is a well structured approach that integrates those tools in a controlled, consistent way.
And that's what allows these models to scale.
Because one of the biggest challenges isn't implementing decentralized elements once, it's doing it repeatedly across multiple studies without introducing variability each time.
That requires standardization at a certain level and
Not rigid standardization, but a consistent framework.
clear expectations for how data is collected, how systems are validated, how monitoring is performed, and how decisions are documented,
And that framework needs to be flexible enough to adapt to different study designs.
which is where a lot of organizations are still evolving. Like
They may have successful pilots or individual studies that work well, but scaling that approach across a portfolio requires more alignment.
across teams, across systems, and across processes.
And that alignment becomes even more important as the volume of data continues to grow.
Because data is really at the center of all of this.
Decentralized trials generate more data, more frequently, and from more sources.
That creates opportunity, but it also increases the importance of how that data is managed.
How it's integrated, how it's reviewed, and how it's used to support decisions.
And that's where data strategy starts to play a much bigger role.
It's not just about collecting data, it's about structuring it in a way that makes it usable and reliable.
And making sure that it can support both real time decision making and regulatory review. Um,
Because those two things need to align.
you can't optimize for speed at the expense of traceability.
And you can't build systems that are so rigid that they limit flexibility.
So there's a balance there that organizations need to find.
And that balance tends to come back to the same core principles we've been talking about.
Clarity, structure, and consistency.
Understanding how the system is designed, how it's being used, and how it's controlled.
and making sure that understanding is shared across the organization.
Because decentralized trials involve more moving parts.
More systems, more stakeholders, more interactions.
And without that shared understanding, it becomes harder to maintain alignment.
Which is where issues can start to surface.
And I think that's why this shift is as much about organizational maturity as it is about technology.
Companies that are able to integrate these elements effectively tend to have strong foundations.
Clear governance, well defined processes, and good communication across functions.
And those things allow them to adapt more easily as new tools and approaches are introduced.
Because this isn't a static environment.
Technology will continue to evolve, expectations will continue to shift, and new models will emerge. Organizations that build flexible, well structured systems will be in a better position to adapt to that.
They won't need to redesign everything each time something changes.
They'll be able to adjust within a framework that already supports control and consistency. And that's really what defines the future of clinical trials. Not just decentralization or digitalization on their own, but how those elements are integrated into a system that is scalable, reliable, and aligned with regulatory expectations.
And when you take all of this together, the direction is pretty clear. Clinical trials are becoming more flexible, more patient-centered, and more data-driven. But the expectations around control, consistency, and reliability are not changing. If anything, they're becoming more visible as these models expand.
What's shifting is how those expectations are applied. Instead of being concentrated at a physical site, they're now distributed across systems, technologies, and patient interactions. That means sponsors need a broader view of how trials are designed, how data flows, and how oversight is maintained across the entire process. And that's where structure becomes critical, not to limit flexibility, but to support it.
Because without a clear framework, decentralized elements can introduce variability that's difficult to manage. With the right structure in place, that same flexibility becomes an advantage. It allows organizations to improve access, increase efficiency, and make more informed decisions throughout the trial.
And I think that's the key takeaway. This isn't about replacing traditional models or adopting new technology for the sake of it. It's about evolving how trials are conducted in a way that maintains trust in the data and the outcomes.
Organizations that approach this thoughtfully, with a focus on integration, visibility, and consistency, are going to be in a much stronger position moving forward.
Because at the end of the day, the success of any clinical trial still comes down to confidence. Like,
Confidence in how the study was designed, how the data was collected, and how the results can be interpreted.
and that doesn't change, even as the model itself evolves.
Thank you for joining us for today's deep dive. If your organization needs support designing decentralized trial models, strengthening data integrity, or aligning clinical operations with regulatory expectations, Emma International is here to help. You can reach us anytime at info@emmainternational.com or visit us at emmainternational.com.
Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and Spotify so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay innovative.